and I've heard this from more people since her, but she was just the first one I heard it from, was I felt really invalidated and I thought therapy wasn't for me because the therapist told me that I need to set a boundary and cut my family off. They're toxic.
Divya Robin is a licensed psychotherapist, wellness educator, content creator, and media contributor in New York City. She specializes in relationships and millennial issues with an extensive understanding of the complexities that arise in modern relationships. She is committed to helping people create healthy relationships and has empowered millions on social media to elevate their relationships and find deep connections. Welcome to the Safe Space, Divya. Divya, thank you so much for being in our safe space. We're so excited to have you, especially since your expertise is talking about relationship dynamics, friendship dynamics, and also cultural psychology. So please, tell us about yourself and some of the projects that you're working on now.
Thank you so much for having me on here and into your safe space. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. So a little bit about me is I am a licensed therapist. I practice in New York City and in Hoboken, New Jersey. I specialize working with adolescents and adults struggling with anxiety, relationship struggles, life transitions, and trauma. I'm really passionate also about cross-cultural issues because that is what brought me to the therapy field. I came into the therapy field with a lot of curiosity about culture, coming from a South Asian immigrant household where mental health was just not really discussed, but I'd seen a lot of struggling and suffering in my communities. And I always wondered, why isn't this being talked about? And so I'd seen also a lot of lack of representation. And that was something that I was very passionate about changing, to be able to make change through education. Because I think the more we know, then the more we can use that knowledge toward change. So that was what drove me to the field. And then I've been in New York City and I just love practicing here. I love the diverse community. I love that there's always growth. And so that's what kept me here.
And how did you start posting about mental health issues on social media? Because a lot of therapists are a bit afraid to go on social media. They worry that their clients will see them, that they won't be able to have integrity in the therapy because it's less about them.
Yeah.
I get this a lot too as someone who's on social media, that other doctors will say, well, aren't you worried that your patients will see you and won't this affect the therapy? So I love talking to other mental health providers who are doing the same thing. So tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I will say those are absolutely thoughts that I have had, and there are some days that I have them more than others. So it is really something that is hard to navigate because it's a newer thing, that being on social media and also being a healthcare provider, and how can you balance both of these identities? So for me, I'd gotten started in 2020. I definitely had seen a lot of social media accounts and blogs and creative outlets get started around the pandemic time. It had been something that I had wanted to do, mostly because I kind of thought about what is something that I wish I would have seen when I was struggling at a younger age or when mental health wasn't talked about. Because I know that mental health access and resources and conversations are not a privilege that everyone is able to have. And so it started off more so of me posting in ways of what do I wish that I could see. And it was very much determined by my struggles. And that's kind of what inspired my account. And also because I wanted to show that I'm human as well. I think there's a way to balance being professional and also being human. And so I do struggle with that at times because I don't see so many people in this space. So that's why it's nice having conversations like this. But yeah, it drove me to, because I wanted to create that kind of a space, kind of like what the safe space is. I wanted to create that for people on Instagram. And so that's how I'd gotten started in 2020.
It's so important because a lot of people who are out there advocating for mental health issues are people who are living with them.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of doctors, therapists, licensed providers out there doing it. And we're the ones with the most training.
Oh my
right?
gosh. You see so much on social media that it's not through a lens of people who are informed and educated and trained. And it's so harmful.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think that it is important to have people who are not clinicians talking about their experiences because that decreases stigma. At the same time, your individual situation does not represent everyone else's.
Yeah.
And it's such a difference when you have someone like yourself who's seen simple cases and complex cases, who's seen people of multiple backgrounds, who've seen treatment successes and failures. So you have that knowledge where you can put together informative and evidence-based information out there versus someone who's just speaking from one perspective.
Totally. Yeah, that's a very good way to put it, because it's more of a holistic perspective, I would say, when you are both someone who struggles, because we all struggle in some kind of a way. So we can speak to our own struggles, but then also when you are someone who's put a lot of hours into training and education to be able to see things in a holistic perspective, there's so much value for both of it. But I totally think that it can be really hard to navigate in the social media space, because there can be this worry of the judgment, like you'd said, of what if clients see or what if other people see. But I have come to go about it with the perspective that the fear of me having that, it's smaller at this point than how many people it's helping. So just kind of reminding me with that, but it's really hard. So it is nice to talk to other practitioners and providers who also have found some kind of a home on social media.
Well, I teach this to young doctors at NYU and Columbia, and sometimes they'll say, well, I don't want to be there. I don't want to do it. And I always say, if you don't do it, someone's going to do it.
Yeah.
If you're not on that screen, someone else is going to do it. And there's someone who's not going to be as qualified, right? So it's really our responsibility to put out the information.
I agree.
And one of the things I love about your feed is the toxic friendships. Like, how do you navigate relationships that are not healthy for you? Yeah. We've all had them. Even as therapists, we have them, right? And it's just so hard, because there used to be this trope of like, you should be happy on your own. If you can't find self-love, something's wrong with you. But no, we are human beings. We connect to others. And if someone we love harms us, it hurts. And sometimes we don't get over it. So please tell us about those tips. How do you navigate breaking up with a friend? Because we talk about breakups with a loved one, with a romantic relationship, but how do we navigate breaking up with a friend who is toxic?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really good to first acknowledge and just normalize that friendships can be toxic too, because we talk a lot about how romantic relationships can be toxic, but not enough about friendships. And I think there's so much shame in it as well, because like, think about it, from the time we're young, we're just fed this message of friends are forever, right? That BFFs, and we have to think that friends are something that is forever, versus relationships. Of course, we would want them to be forever, but we hear more that relationships, there can be breakups, things can happen, people can get divorced, right? We like hear that messaging more than what we hear with friendships. And so there's a lot of shame and stigma that I think keeps people in friendships, because one, they don't realize that friendships can be toxic, and two, they think something is wrong with them if they do decide to either end or shift the dynamics in a friendship. And so that holds people to that. And I think the biggest thing also that people struggle with in toxic friendships is they don't think about what's toxic for them. Like, sure, there are some things that are a little bit more like universally harmful, but then there are also just some deal breakers for individual people. And we don't take the time to think about what are some things for me and my mental health and my well-being that are toxic in relationships. And so that also doesn't have us be curious about that in our friendships.
I never thought about that, because I know, like, I'm obsessed with Disney.
Oh, yeah.
I love fairy tales. Yeah. And I remember when Frozen came out, and I was like, what is this? What? She's like, this is not a love story. And now that I have a daughter, and I'm like, this is a really good love story, because it's really about the friendship between the sisters.
Yeah.
Whereas when I was growing up, it was The Little Mermaid. I had the biggest crush on Prince Eric.
Oh, yeah.
Like, he was so dreamy. But we are fed this narrative of like happily ever after. But then now we know better. Like, marriages don't last. Partnerships don't last. Yeah. And then we're also fed this narrative of the BFF, right? The heart. Dude, I had one of
and
those
the bracelets. Like,
yes.
you have best friend bracelets, necklaces.
Right. Yeah. And it's not a healthy narrative, because we aren't supposed to be with the same person from childhood to adulthood. And that's great if that's you. You're lucky. But you do outgrow your friends. You do outgrow people. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that it's not for you right now. It's not edifying you. It's not building you up.
Totally. Yeah.
So how would you approach that with, let's say, a client? If a client is coming to you and you're hearing these things, like, you as a therapist, you don't ever tell them what to do, but you listen and you gently try and help them to see perhaps where some behaviors are harmful. And if you have a client come into you and they're just like saying these things, and this friend is, repeatedly showing who they are, but the person has a really hard time seeing it, or they are in denial and they don't want to break up.
Yeah.
How do you support someone?
I think as therapists, one of the biggest mistakes we can make too is what you had said that we definitely shouldn't do is give advice, right? But like project our own. Well, just because that's something that we are like, that's bad, we have to think about what are their needs too, right? And so I'm always curious with people is, well, what are you getting out of this friendship? What are your needs in relationships? Or what are your needs specifically in a friendship? And most of the time when I ask people that, they are like, I've never thought of that. I guess to just have a friend, but it goes so much deeper than that. Like, what are you getting out of that friendship? How are they supporting your well-being? What does the connection look like with them? And many times in these toxic friendships, when they're either one-sided or the friend is putting them down, or, there's just other kinds of harmful behaviors, someone's needs are consistently also not getting met. They're actually being harmed in more ways. And so asking people, what are your needs in a friendship? And also helping them and supporting them in that process of, one, discovering what their needs is and empowering those needs. Because many times people don't realize that they're allowed to have needs in friendships, and empowering them that these are your needs, and then taking that next step of, okay, are your needs being met in this friendship, and how can you communicate these needs? And look, sometimes you communicate needs and people can't meet them, and that's really, really hard, but it's also okay, because as we grow as human beings, we can also outgrow friendships. But I really like to start and focus with, what are your needs? What do you need to connect in friendships specifically? Because again, it's not something people really think about. They haven't even, most of the time, I will say like 90% of the time, my response, or how people respond to me with that, is I've never thought of it.
And also therapy is helpful in identifying patterns. And I find that with my clients who are with people who are toxic and narcissistic and neglectful or hurtful, if you look back, you'll see that there was probably a parent or a sibling who was abusive or narcissistic. And this individual just got accustomed to this. Okay, well, this is what love is, And in order for me to have family, to have relationship and friendship, I just got to put up with it. And you don't have to put up with it. And in the therapy, sometimes, like that dynamic will play out between the therapist and the individual. And that's why therapy is so important. I once had a client years ago who would just say sorry all the time. Sorry. I'm like, what are you sorry for? You didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh. And then they realized they often said sorry to their mother. They often said sorry to these people who are abusive in their lives. And they just kind of put up with it. And there was just this martyr complex. But they would not have realized that without the therapy.
Yeah.
And, very early on, we'll see things, but we can't point it out.
I know.
Because you got to build that alliance and that trust.
Absolutely. There's so much power in patterns. And if we just slow down and look at the patterns, we can really understand a lot about the people around us too.
Absolutely. And relationships, especially from a cultural perspective, are really important. We talked about how, there aren't that many people who look like you in the field. So you really are a gift, and you don't have to be of a certain background to understand another background, right? Or else we'd be waiting forever. We'd be on wait lists forever.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right?
There's for a long time.
But cultural competency is really important. And especially in South Asian communities where it's taboo, where at least with, I'm half South Asian, so I know, like, if you say certain things, your market value goes down, right? You're not going to be able to be married off as easily sometimes, right? So there's a lot of stigma there. And what are some of the things that you're doing to combat that stigma?
Yeah. Empowering people that they are allowed to have a voice, and that they're allowed to have needs. They're allowed to have wants and desires, because I think a lot of the time that can be silenced. And also that silencing can further the struggle, right? Like, mental health conditions, of course, much of it is biological in ways too, and we don't talk about it. But being able to start to have a voice, and it's been really powerful that I just realized, talking about one story, if one person talks about it, it can really have an impact. And so that's something that I've actually seen through my Instagram, in a way that this was I grew up at going to an Indian church. So I come from a Christian background, and there are very, very small amount of Indian Christians too. Mm-hmm. And so it's one of the minority religions in India. So to go to our church, we'd have to drive like over an hour as a kid. Wow. And so we'd like on Sunday, I put like my parents, we'd all put our Indian clothes on and like drive to church. But my dad still goes to that church, and he had called me a few months ago, and he was like, he knows I do social media and like media contributions, and he knows that, but he said that one of the middle schoolers there, and I don't know the middle schoolers now, they're because they were all babies, yeah. Like when I was there last, but he said that they came up to him and was like, oh, Divya's I see you posted on social media, and her content helped me talk to my parents about my mental health. Wow. And yeah, it was really emotional. And my dad told me that and was like, wow, they said this. And I was like, that is what it is. It's one person mm-hmm. who looks like you. Because if that was the case when I was younger, and like one person did that, I think that would be so life-changing for me. But, unfortunately, that wasn't the case so many years ago. But like now we have this power mm-hmm. to be able to talk. And so really just one story talking about struggle and normalizing it and stigma, I think that can really have a domino effect. And that's something that in our cultural communities, we have to use our voices when we have the education. So, like with what both of us do, when you have this kind of education, whether it be from graduate school, from training, some fellowships, to be able to use it in a way that can amplify other voices that look similar to you, so they can learn more too.
And validates others, right? Yeah. Because when they see that someone that looks like them is talking about this openly, then they don't feel like there's anything wrong with them. Mm-hmm. This does exist. This is not an other thing, right? Because you hear that a lot. It's like, well, these are problems only that only happen to people when they come to America. Yeah. Like, no, they've happened.
We just haven't talked about them.
Or we called it something different, yeah. right? In the Christian community, it's explained away with spirituality mm-hmm. or sometimes because of misdeeds, and that's not the case. You can have your faith, and you can also get evidence-based treatment because you deserve it.
Totally.
And one of the areas of your expertise is romantic relationships. Yeah. And attachment theory is something that a lot of people don't think about, they don't know about. Mm-hmm. And what if someone pulled us aside and taught us how to love? What if, like, when we were little kids, it was like, along with your math and science, this is how you can pick a healthy relationship. This is how you know what an unhealthy relationship is. Mm-hmm. This is this type of attachment. This is other types of attachment. This is healthy. This is not healthy, right? Imagine if we had that education, mm-hmm. how much better off we'd be.
I know, because then we have the skills again to know what to accept and what is not acceptable, right? And we'd also be able to have more insights into the patterns. But we just go into relationships a lot of the time just not knowing what to look for. We just think, do I have the relationship? Check. That's it. And not what should I look for in the relationships. And I totally agree that if we had some kind of way to talk about it, then it would be so helpful for many. Because just because we have relationships in our life don't mean they're full examples of maybe the relationships we want to grow into in our adulthood. We can take elements of relationships we witnessed from our childhood and bring them into our adult relationships, like the elements that serve us and the elements we feel inspired by. But that might not be the whole thing. And so learning about other aspects of what build healthy relationships helps us feel more empowered, because it's like, I'm choosing these aspects from maybe a caretaker's relationship, and that I found to be healthy and inspirational, and I'm going to follow that. And then here are some other aspects of like evidence-based mm-hmm. Research that shows into healthy connection, healthy communication, depth, and things like that. We can pull it all together.
And we don't understand the ways that we love. We don't understand the way that we attach, right? Sometimes we're anxious and we're afraid of being abandoned. We don't know that that's a reflection of something that happened earlier in life where we were probably devalued and then praised or ignored and neglected. And we're trying to get one person to fulfill our every need, to complete us. And that's just not fair to that one person, right? And we do learn our love from our parents. Mm-hmm. And in the religious community, a lot of times the dogma that's preached is about being faithful to someone at all costs. But we know now that that is not the way to be. Mm-hmm. That if someone's unhealthy towards you, you have a right And you can set limits, you can set boundaries before it gets to the point where it's out of control and it's harder to leave because you've already invested with them, right? Like a home, kids, and etc.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like this like toxic loyalty in a way that you, and also that you feel you're a bad person, because a lot of what I even see in not only romantic relationships, but friendships as well is, oh, but I've known them for all these years, right? And we like excuse this toxic and incredibly harmful behavior from the longevity of a relationship. And so just to normalize that is not an indicator. The longevity of a relationship is not an indicator of that you should stay, and can be really powerful because so many people don't even feel like they have a choice.
And I get a lot of questions about boundaries with family members. I'll get DMs from people who are like, in my community, it's not even an option. Like, I can't set a boundary because then I will have no family. And I can't not have a family because I am a minority. You know, I don't want to be alone. So how do you navigate that? Because I'm sure you get questions with, you know, from your community, from your patients all the time about how to navigate boundaries in communities where that's not even a thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I had to one of my first patients that I had seen in my internship. She started working with me, and she chose me actually. She was South Asian, and she chose me because I was a South Asian therapist. And one of the first things she said was, I've never really seen a South Asian therapist. So I was like, we're trying to make more of them out here. But she'd said that her last experience with therapy, and I've heard this from more people since her, but she was just the first one I heard it from, was I felt really invalidated and I thought therapy wasn't for me because the therapist told me that I need to set a boundary and cut my family off. They're toxic. Wow. And yeah, and you know, I've actually heard that from a few people, whether it be patients or people in my community. I've had therapists tell me that I need to just cut my family off, set the boundary, they're not good for me. And boundaries are also something that has to fit within a cultural context, right? Like we have to also look at, I love that you brought that point of, I'm already a minority. I don't have a lot of people here who look like me. So family serves that purpose of having like the community, whether it be of having cultural community, having your cuisine, like all of that. So it's like setting boundaries in a way, it doesn't have to be so black and white. Like for time boundaries, I say a lot around the holidays that, do you have to go that entire time? Can a boundary be around time? That instead of maybe going for the whole weekend from Thursday to Sunday, you go Friday, Saturday, or taking some time to yourself. And it can even be like, look, I'm going to go run actually and get those groceries. Like, you know, we're having Thanksgiving, we forgot the stuffing. Let me go to the grocery store. Like taking time to remove yourself from a situation, because it's going to look different person to person. And so I always work with my patients because they're coming for their specific circumstance and therapy and treatment. And we can, I work through an evidence-based model, but I adjust it for what each person needs. And so it's not one size fits all, and neither is boundaries. So it has to be looked at in that kind of a way. And it doesn't have to look like fully cutting someone out, right? Because some people, that's just not an option. But it can be around setting limits around time, around exposure to that person, or even how much access you let that person have in your life.
And it's yet another opportunity to learn from our clients, to have them as a part of the treatment team, right? And not assuming that just because they're part of one culture that everyone's the same. Understand what their subculture is, what their family culture is, what they feel comfortable with doing right now, you know, because it's baby steps. Yeah. These things are not going to change overnight. Nope. So don't expect your patient to change overnight.
Yes. And also for it to feel good for them. You know, the first time you do anything is going to feel uncomfortable. And so also not pushing this message that boundaries feel good. I see that on social media a lot. You feel great setting boundaries. The first time I set a boundary, because again, boundaries are not a thing for me growing up. If I set a boundary, I mean, I don't even know what would happen. We just didn't do it. I felt so uncomfortable. I felt I was the worst person in the world. I'd done something terrible. And normalizing to people that changing any behavior, especially a pattern of behavior, that takes time. It's uncomfortable. So I think also with boundary setting, what's really important for me is to work on distress tolerance skills. Yeah. I work a lot through DBT as well. And the distress tolerance skills really go hand in hand with me for boundaries. So whenever I talk about boundaries with someone, I'm always talking about distress tolerance too, and normalizing. It feels uncomfortable to set boundaries. And here are some skills for that, because we need to add that to the conversation too, because boundaries don't always feel empowering and great. There are times you probably leave from setting a boundary and you feel worse.
I study high functioning conditions in my lab, and it's really interesting because what I found is that when I meet incredible people like you, there are always times where people have it all perfect on the outside. People think they're rock stars, they're doing all these things, but then they were quietly struggling.
Yeah.
And I wonder if there was a time like that where you felt this way, and what did you do to get through that?
Yeah. So the time that I really had felt that way was in college. And so we talked a little bit about my South Asian background and, loyalty and relationships and a lot of that. And when I was in college, my parents had filed for divorce. And divorce is something that is so stigmatized, both in the South Asian community, but also in the Christian community. And so it was something that I didn't even really know how to comprehend. And I didn't know how to talk about it. And I was always someone who on the outside was outgoing, kind of had it together. I was managing jobs and internships and getting good grades and having relationships. And so I was trying to hold all of that together still while really struggling with what was going on at home. But I also felt like I couldn't talk about it much because there was so much internalized shame and stigma. And so that was really hard for me because I was managing this kind of expectation of who I had held myself to be for all of these years, while also going through something that was very behind closed doors. Thankfully, now we talk more about these topics. And so it is something that I really want to let people know more about, that, it's not unheard of. But at the time, it was very unheard of. And I didn't have a single friend who had parents who were divorced that were South Asian, Christian, those kind of cultural dynamics. And so I didn't know who to turn to about it. And so I really kept it to myself. And there were many years that I didn't talk to people about it. And for me to get through it, what helped, I had a therapist that I went to at my college counseling center who, oh my gosh, she was really amazing for me in the start of my therapy journey. And I also had met my husband around that time, which, when I reflect back on that situation, I am so thankful for that relationship with him, because it was a place where I felt like I could be vulnerable and learn how to have a healthy relationship while simultaneously watching a relationship so close to me kind of disintegrating. It was a really powerful experience to be able to kind of have this corrective emotional experience, as we say in therapy, with another person. And so with that, I always like to kind of send this message that to not use pain and hardship as something to determine and write off the rest of our life, right? It was hard for me to open myself up to a relationship, but it was also one of the most healing things for me in that time. So definitely the mix of my husband and us navigating a relationship together, and then also therapy, had been something that really got me through that time.
Wow, that's wonderful. And, divorce is taboo in certain cultures, and especially in religions. Mm-hmm. And it's so common.
Yeah.
So we should be talking about it.
Yeah, divorce.
That's how we get support.
Even relationships dysfunctional marriages, those are things we don't talk about at all in cultural elements. And there's something that so many people experience behind closed doors. And especially, I would say, in the South Asian culture, I'd experienced, and I know you said your house half South Asian, so I don't know if this is something you relate to as well, but there's this high functioning within the culture, right? To have it together, to get the grades, to be on top, extracurriculars. And so you have this pressure to be held to this standard while also struggling with things. And so many people struggle with a lot of complicated family dynamics, being not only South Asian, but many cultures, right, where it's stigmatized to talk about this. But at the same time, there's this pressure of have it all together, don't look like anything is wrong, get the best grades, be the top of your class. And so it can really lead to that high functioning anxiety and depression.
And it's exhausting.
Yeah, so
How
exhausting.
can you put on that facade for so long with so many things going on without support?
Yeah.
Right? When you talk about it, you get support. If you don't talk about it, people think everything's fine. You won't get the support, and then you burn out. And also, just that whole perfectionism, things can't be different. They have to be the same. But that's just not realistic. No one can do that. No. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
You are just so wonderful.
This was so lovely. I really appreciate it. And we brought in so many elements that go into relationships, and talking about relationships and the intersection with culture is something that just gets me so excited. So I'm glad that we were able to talk about it, but also that you had shared some of what brought you to what you were and how it's a passionate topic for you as well.
Thank you. And tell us about what you have coming up next. Tell us about your projects and where we can find you.
Yes, that would be great. So on Instagram, you can find me at Mind Matters with Div. You can also go to my website, divyarobin.com, and there you can have access to, I do monthly workshops, I have master classes, I have free events, and then downloadables such as ebooks and guides and things like that. I always want to be able to give resources, again, for many things that I wish I had growing up. So I have a lot that's on there. And then for daily mental health and relationship tips and tidbits, to head over to my Instagram.
Awesome.
Great.
That was great.
Thank you. This was so lovely.